It's the weekend, and you have financial questions that need answering. That can only mean one thing. It's time for Jill on Money, the show that takes the mystery out of your finances. Here's your host, Jill Schlesinger.
Welcome to your holiday show, your weekend holiday show. It's Christmas. Not really. Not Christmas yet, but it's the weekend before Christmas. And there's no way that we're working, obviously, this weekend because Mark and I need a little time off. So what we decided to do was to take some of our favorite interviews from throughout the year and play them for you. This may be, Mark, was this your absolute favorite, this one, or not? This is when, officially, when Mark became obsessed with Diana Henriques. She is an author and a journalist. She's a journalist first and an author. I met her after she wrote a book called The Wizard of Lies, which, by the way, was a New York Times bestseller about the Bernie Madoff scandal. And she's written other books. But the reason we had her on the show during the year was that she had actually overseen the sale of The Wizard of Lies to HBO, and they made a movie out of it. So let's get to our interview with Diana Henriques. Let's talk a little bit about why you were drawn to the Bernie Madoff story in the first place. Now, you covered it for the Times, right?
I did. I covered it really from the minute that the headlines moved. But I had actually covered Bernie before, Jill. I don't know if we discussed this earlier, but when I was working for the Times, and Madoff's firm pioneered after-hours trading. So if you wanted to know what was happening in the stock market after the big board closed, who are you going to call? You're going to call the Madoff trading desk. So he was name in my Rolodex, to pull up an ancient term. But I had also covered a couple of stories in which he figured more prominently in the late 90s and early 2000s. So I knew who he was. I knew who the world thought he was.
And the world thought he was this very charming, smart guy, part of the infrastructure of not just the trading organization, but he held positions of power.
He did. He was incredibly influential in the evolution of NASDAQ. He was incredibly forward-looking in terms of automated computer trading, trading platforms, electronic trading platforms. Funny story, the minute I saw the headline about him, the first drill for a reporter is you look at the archives. What was the last thing we wrote about Bernie Madoff? And the first story that came up in the New York Times electronic archives was a story about a partnership that had been announced between to build a new electronic trading platform between Madoff and Citibank, Merrill Lynch, Morgan Stanley, and I think J.P. Morgan. These unbelievable firms. And I'm saying, my goodness, this man has just been arrested. So it's a classic Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde story. I knew Dr. Jekyll. I knew the Bernie Madoff that he was proud to say he was. The Madoff who was respected by regulators, who was not only admired, but actually really liked by colleagues on the street. He and his brother Peter were well-liked and popular figures on the street. No one knew the Dr. Hyde facet of his life until it exploded on that day in December 2008.
And so when you saw the headline, did something in you click? Did you say, oh, my God, that actually does make sense or not?
No. The criminality never made sense, but I'll tell you what happened. I've covered lots of criminals. I've covered lots of fraudsters, even lots of Ponzi schemers. And nothing in those stories hooked me the way this did, because by the end of that first night, we knew that Madoff had been turned in to the FBI by his 2 sons. And that fact, without knowing yet that the sons were blameless, without knowing whether they were his accomplices or his innocent, horrified offspring, it was Shakespearean. I mean,
Totally.
truly. I mean, at that point, either they were his accomplices and had betrayed him, or they were innocent of this crime and had been so devastatingly betrayed. So from a human standpoint, that was a facet of this fraud that I had not seen in all my earlier years of covering white-collar crime. And I think that's one of the reasons that this story has such staying power. The depth of this betrayal, I mean, it's as old as Jacob and Esau. I mean, the fact that someone you love and trust that much would betray you that devastatingly. And consider the times, too, Jill. The whole country felt like they had trusted Wall Street and Wall Street had betrayed them.
Right. He is the metaphor.
Suddenly, he is the face of that betrayal.
Right. So when you started covering the story, so that's the end of 2008, it's 2009, things are happening. Talk about how you got access to him. Like, what was happening? Were you sending him love letters in prison? Like, what was happening? Hi, love D. What was going on?
Well, it wasn't quite like that, but I was regularly writing him letters. I had tried to get in to see him even before he was incarcerated. And then as soon as he was down at the Metropolitan Correction Center downtown in Manhattan, tried again. His lawyers just kept throwing up bars. Absolutely not, absolutely not. Not until he's sentenced. And then, of course, in June of 2009, he was sentenced to 150 years in federal prison. When he arrived at the facility in North Carolina, I started writing him. And every time one of the new books about the Madoff scandal came out, one of the new quickie books would come out, I'd write him again. And I'd say, if you don't ever tell your side of the story, this two-dimensional cartoon figure here is all the world is ever going to know about you. And if that's what you want your grandchildren to be able to learn about what happened, then fine. But if you want a deeper, more human picture, I hope you'll talk to me. And I just kept that same message over and over again. And ultimately, I think in the fall of 2009, he sent me a little short handwritten note saying that he didn't feel like he could talk to anyone yet because of the civil litigation affecting his family in the bankruptcy court. But if he ever did, I would be at the top of his list. That's the Madoff charm working there, The following spring, I think the headlines had eased a bit. He felt like perhaps his family had moved a little bit away from the whipping post, and his lawyer let me know that he was reconsidering his decision.
Merry almost Christmas. It's not Christmas yet, really, while I'm recording this. But anyway, you're listening to Jill on Money, and when we return, we'll get back to one of our favorite interviews of the year with Diana Henriques, the author of The Wizard of Lies. We'll be right back. You're back with Jill on Money, and it is Christmas weekend. So in honor of that, we're not working. Mark is probably right around this moment huddled around his coffee maker, which he's not given me any information about at this time because he has a whole system in place, and I want to get my sister-in-law to give it to me as my birthday Hanukkah Christmas gift. And I can't give her the information because Mark is not being forthcoming with it. Well, if it's for free, then I got to figure out what you should get me, which I guess will be just a bottle of booze. Maybe I'll do that. Maybe I'll just do that. When in doubt, you can always get me a good bottle of single malt scotch as a gift. Remember that, listeners. All right, we want to get back to our interview with Diana Henriques, the author of The Wizard of Lies. It was one of our absolute favorite interviews of the year, and there's nothing more fascinating than learning the story behind the story, and this is what Diana does so well. She tells us about how she started interviewing Bernie Madoff, Ponzi schemer extraordinaire. So here we go, more of our interview from earlier this year with Diana Henriques. When you start interviewing him, and you do it over the course of a number of months, what is he trying to convince you of?
Well, we had some bones of contention. And one of his big missions, I think, one of his big goals was to persuade me that this fraud actually started when he claimed it started. And I do not believe that. He claimed that he had been an honest investment manager until 1993, and then pressures of withdrawals and bad markets forced him into this Ponzi scheme. I don't buy that for a minute, and I've told him over and over again that it just doesn't make any sense. I think it was a Ponzi scheme at least by the mid-1980s, and of course the prosecutors claimed in later trials of other people that it was a Ponzi scheme as early as 1978.
Wow.
So that was one of his missions, I think, was to try to make the case. And his goal for that, I think, was to try to shelter as much of his family's income as possible by
drawing
that line and saying everything before here was clean money. They're entitled to keep that. It didn't work, of course, but I think that was one of his goals. But I also think we have to remember the scale of the narcissism involved here. I have never met a con man who didn't think he could con me. I've never met a con man who didn't think that if he could just sit down and talk with me and explain it all to me, I'd get his side. And Madoff was no different than that. I think he felt that he could persuade me that his version of the truth, his view of himself as a embattled money manager who just got on the wrong side of the market and was swept away before he could make things right again. And who is being vilified by all these greedy investors who should be grateful for all the money he made for them over the years. That was the Madoff theme song, and he, I think, thought that he could sell that.
You know what's very interesting, though, about his scheme versus so many other Ponzi schemes, which is he never promised to hit a home run. And that was sort of like the sheer brilliance that was underlying the scheme.
And don't underestimate the brilliance of Ponzi schemers. I think they have an annual conference where they have workshops on how to do it. And there's the Madoff technique now. The Madoff method of running a Ponzi scheme is exactly that. Never promise pie in the sky. Never pressure people to invest right this minute. In fact, if possible, tell them you just don't even want their money until they're begging you to take it. That was Madoff's method. And never make it sound too good to be true. There's a great line that Pat Huddleston, the fraud analyst, observed about Madoff. He said, if it sounds too good to be true, you're dealing with an amateur.
Oh, my God, that's great.
And it's so great because Bernie was a pro. He could never have persuaded two retired chairmen of Merrill Lynch, retired CEOs of Merrill Lynch, the retired chairman of Morgan Stanley, the famous economist of Salomon Brothers. He never could have persuaded those people to buy into what we think of as the classic Ponzi scheme.
Right. It's not a get-rich-quick scheme.
No, never was. It was just a conservative, steady, not volatile investment. It was sort of like the hedge fund world's money market fund. It was liquid, far more liquid than most hedge funds were. And that, of course, was its undoing because when the financial crisis hit in 2008, lots of his biggest investors had to pull money out, not because they thought he was a fraud, but because it was the most liquid asset they had.
So all those redemptions come in, and then
he does not have the money to cover them.
When you first went in to start the interview process with him. Did you think the kids were guilty? Did you have an opinion?
I did have an opinion, and the answer was emphatically no.
Really?
Well, look at the circumstances. Both of his sons were represented by a single attorney. That raised eyebrows immediately among my friends in the defense bar, because they said, well, if those two men have any criminal liability, they need separate lawyers. They need separate counsel, because the best deal for one of them might be to roll over on the other one to testify against his brother, which would, of course, just amplify the Shakespearean tragedy here. But that didn't happen. They didn't get separate counsel. They continued to be represented by the same lawyer. So that gave you something you had to explain away, and I could never explain it away. Also, as I became more convinced from my research, and this is before I interviewed Madoff, as I became more convinced from my research that this fraud was much older than he was claiming, that it had gone back at least 8 to 10 years earlier than he claimed. Well, his sons were in high school.
Yeah, that doesn't make sense.
Junior high. So how did that conversation go when one of them comes out of the University of Michigan and the other one comes out of the Wharton School and decide to go to work for Dad? And he calls them in and says, look, Mark, Andy, I have to tell you something. Got a great little wholesale trading business here, and downstairs we're running a Ponzi scheme.
Yeah.
And they say, oh, Dad, that sounds like fun. Sure, we'll hang out. It never made emotional logic that he would have exposed them to that fraud. Once you knew it was already in progress the day they arrived at the firm. At that point, it became impossible, really.
But not with his brother, because his brother was there from the beginning.
His brother was there from the beginning. And, of course, Peter Madoff did plead guilty to a set of securities fraud charges and is serving a prison term as a result of his failure to police what his brother was doing. He was the chief compliance officer at the firm, a lawyer by training. He really had no excuse for not having uncovered this fraud, but he insisted right up to his sentencing hearing that he had not known about the Ponzi scheme. He had simply trusted his brother and done what his brother had told him. And what his brother told him to do put him in that legal peril.
Now, what happened to Peter's daughter, Shayna? How did she end up in this? Because she was in the compliance department also.
She was the deputy counsel to the firm. No charges were ever brought against her. Like every member of the Madoff family, she faced civil litigation from the bankruptcy trustee claiming assets. The theory there being that everything that anybody who worked for the firm got were the fruits of Bernie's crime.
You're listening to Jill on Money, and we are playing one of our favorite interviews of 2017. Diana Henriques, the author of Wizard of Lies, star of the motion picture through HBO. And our phone number here, 855-411-JILL. Our email address is askjill@jillonmoney.com. We'll be right back.
Oh, the weather outside is frightful, but the fire is...
You're back with Jill on Money, and it is the weekend before Christmas. So for all of you procrastinators out there, get going. I don't know. I'm not really a procrastinator, but I do tend to be unusually late in my purchasing of gifts. Usually because I'm doing so much stuff for work that I'm trying to slam everything into the end. So we are taping this intro in order to give you really a slice of heaven, which is one of our favorite interviews of the year with Diana Henriques, the author of Wizard of Lies. We had her on earlier in the year because Wizard of Lies was made into an HBO movie. And so here in this segment, we're talking about the victims of the Madoff Ponzi scheme. When the bankruptcy proceedings go on, they claw back all the money. Now, are all of these investors that were Madoff investors who said, my life savings gone, has everyone recouped a bunch of money? And how much of that? I mean, years later now.
Well, this all has to be said in the context of some investors weren't eligible to recover anything because they were indirect investors, several layers removed from Madoff himself. Other investors were not eligible to recover anything because over the life of their Madoff account, they had taken out more than they had originally
That's
put
like the
in.
Wilpons.
Yes, and so they had to give money back. They got no money in recovery. And then the big caveat, what is being returned to the investors who are eligible to recover money is their original capital.
Not what they thought they made.
Not what they thought they had made over time. So if you were a good little school teacher, and I've talked with one good little school teacher putting her money with Madoff, and you put in over time your $200,000 in savings, and you watched it grow to $1 million, $1.5 million, and you think you are set for retirement. You're going to buy the RV. You're going to cruise the state parks and the federal parks. That's going to be your retirement. And then you discover, A, it's all gone, and B, if you recover everything you're eligible for, it's your $200,000.
You get your basis back.
You get your basis back. And so, yes, the small investors have all been made whole in terms of getting their investors back. By that, I mean those who were entitled to recover $1 million or less. They have all gotten their capital back, which is a remarkable outcome for a Ponzi scheme. Among the larger investors, who, of course, in many cases have small investors relying on them for recovery, I think we're around 57 to 60 cents on the dollar in recovery now. But here we are, 2017, and this liquidation recovery process is not yet complete.
It's amazing.
It is amazing. We don't really have a competent structure in this country to deal with a financial fraud on this scale, particularly a cross-border fraud. There are claimants in Luxembourg, claimants in Spain, claimants in France and Brazil and London who are all being treated differently because their countries have different bankruptcy schemes. And so a global fraud like this, it's sort of like the financial regulators of the world just throw up their hands and say, okay, dive in and grab what you can.
Right. Good luck. Let's get back to Bernie for a second. So you said he's the ultimate narcissist. A lot of times we heard these terms that were thrown around to describe him. He's a sociopath. He's a narcissist. Did you actually talk to a shrink about what you thought who this guy really was clinically?
I did, Jill. I would not just one. I was invited to meet with the psychiatric faculty's grand rounds at a major New York hospital to talk about Bernie Madoff. They had read the book and they were eager to discuss my impressions of him and to quiz me about it. And I was eager to quiz them about what these traits and experiences and life stories suggested. But I think we need to be careful about looking for the easy diagnosis here. Yes, without question, Bernie Madoff is a sociopath. But, if you read Walter Isaacson's great biography, Steve Jobs was probably a sociopath. And he didn't, he created one of the most iconic brands in American history. So saying someone is a sociopath doesn't explain why they ran the biggest Ponzi scheme in history.
So why did he?
Well, here's my armchair diagnosis.
Let's do it. Go, doctor.
I had an odd snippet of a conversation with Bernie. If you'll indulge me, let me tell you. Every author wants that aha moment that they can describe in the book. When did you realize When did the hammer fall? When did the blinding flash? So I said, okay, Bernie, when did you first realize that your Ponzi scheme was going to fail? His answer was, it didn't fail. And I said, what? We're sitting here behind bars in the visiting room in Butner, North Carolina prison. So I said, what do you mean? He said, no, it didn't fail. And he goes on to recount all of these bold-faced names who wanted to still invest with him. He claimed he could have raised enough money to cover all of these withdrawals. He had just gotten tired of the whole tap dance and decided to let the fraud fall apart. He had not failed. He had quit. And as I thought about that, as I reflected on that in the final draft of the book, it just struck me that this is a man to this day who cannot admit failure at anything. So I think so long as Madoff was able to be a genius, to win all the approval a narcissist needs by being an honest investment manager, and there were years when the market enabled him to do that, fine, he'd be an honest investment manager. But if the market didn't make it possible for him to be a genius, an admired, loved, revered genius honestly, he would be a genius dishonestly because he could not face failure, couldn't admit failure at anything. So that's there are other episodes that I mention in the book that carry that out, where faced with a crisis where he had to tell the truth and admit failure or lie,
he
lied.
choose the lie. That's fascinating. We'll get back to our interview with Diana Henriques in just a moment. If you need to find us, it's Christmas week. What are you going to do? Just call us, 855-411-JILL. Send us an email, askjill@jillonmoney.com. We'll be right back.
Snow and snow.
You're back with the Christmas weekend Jill on Money show. I'm Jill Schlesinger. Mark's running the show, and we are playing you some of our favorite interviews of the year for the holidays. And this is Diana Henriques, the author of Wizard of Lies, story of Bernie Madoff. Here's a big question. Is someone like that capable of remorse? Before we finish up, is Bernie Madoff capable of having remorse for this, or for his, even just that both sons have now died? It's horrible.
I think that was the one thing about this that really shocked him, was how the world turned on his family. And, traditionally that was quite a departure from history. That white-collar criminals' families are almost always left alone by the media and everybody else. So this was a real aberration. I think to the extent that he is able to feel remorse, it is for the fact that he has utterly destroyed his family. A brother in jail, 2 sons dead, a wife estranged, just completely destroyed a family that he loved. The only argument that you can make that Bernie Madoff isn't a sociopath is that he did apparently love his family. But I noticed over time, Jill, that his attitude towards the investors he had hurt, the lives he had destroyed, thousands and thousands of lives, kids who had to drop out of college, family homes that had to be sold, charities that had to close their doors, as you know. Over the months and the years that we've stayed in touch, I have seen his pretense of remorse, if that's what it was, or his ability to express remorse about that damage just evaporate.
Really?
He is now kind of at the point where he thinks they still should be grateful for all he did for them back in the day. So I don't know if that's how he's protecting himself from the bottomless grief over his family, or if, as he has said to me, and as is said by Bernie Madoff in quotes in the film, he has this capacity to compartmentalize his life in such rigid ways that there is a dike that's holding back that family remorse. And the only way he can keep that like big and strong, is to sustain this coldness towards his other victims.
Are you in touch with him still?
Yes, not frequently, but occasionally. I got a letter from him just a few months ago on an unrelated topic, and I'm on his email list at the prison, so I do occasionally correspond with him. You know, for good or ill, I am his biographer, and I have continuing responsibilities to history to understand where the rest of his life leads him, at least psychologically and mentally, to the extent that I can.
Are you in touch with Ruth?
I have had some conversations with Ruth. Mm-hmm. This is obviously a difficult time for her. I think she has come to understand that through no fault of her own, she has been shackled to this historic fraud. And every time it surfaces, whether through a book or a TV show or a movie or an anniversary, she's going to get dragged back out into the spotlight again. She's an incredibly resilient woman, though.
I guess.
And her grandchildren are a source of great comfort. She has found ways to fill her life, but
and by the way, everyone should know that she has no money. I mean, everything got clawed back.
Yes, she is on an allowance, basically, from the trustee, pending the settlement of the litigation that he has filed against her. A settlement with the Justice Department left her with $2.5 million.
Which is not chump change.
Not chump change. You could buy an annuity with it and maybe live off the income of that annuity in an earlier interest rate environment, but not now. So she was left with $2.5 million, and then the trustee promptly sued her for $44 million, which she transparently doesn't have. That litigation is still pending settlement, and when it is ultimately settled, she'll know what, if anything, she has left. But for now, she has to draw money from the trustee with the trustee's approval. So she doesn't own a home. She rents. She
Down in Florida?
No, she's living in Connecticut now, to be close to where the grandchildren are more or less centered. She's putting one foot in front of the other, getting through the day.
Is there anyone in this whole maze of fraud that got away with something?
Well, Jill, it must be said, every Ponzi schemer has a banker who almost never catches him. The only two things you need to run a Ponzi scheme are trust and a bank account. Well, Bernie had trust, and he had a bank account. And if the bankers of the world were more scrupulous about supervising the uses that are made of their bank accounts, there would be fewer Ponzi schemes. They are the best first line of defense against a Ponzi scheme. The cash flow in and out of a Ponzi scheme slush fund is, shall I say, distinctive. And time and again, the bankers serving Bernie Madoff had their software send off a red flag that something looks odd in this account. And time and again, they made an excuse because it was Bernie. He was a big customer. They didn't want to lose that business.
Well, thanks so much to Diana Henriques. She is a wonderful interview and a wonderful human being. Go get the book Wizard of Lies, as well as her book that was just released this year, A First-Class Catastrophe. That's about the 30th anniversary of the crash of 1987. You're listening to Jill on Money, 855-411-JILL. Send us an email, askjill@jillonmoney.com. We'll be right back. You're back with Jill on Money, and we are so delighted that you're joining us this weekend before Christmas. Maybe you're running around doing all of your last-minute errands, and maybe you are wondering what's coming up next. We're not doing financial questions for the weekend before Christmas, but if you do have a question that you want us to start to deal with in the new year, give us a holler, 855-411-JILL. Our email address is askjill@jillonmoney.com. And, look, I love interviewing all of these people. I have had just the absolute gift in being able to meet and interview some of the really most interesting people out there writing, talking about ideas that are new to me. Hopefully they're new to you. You may have missed a bunch of these interviews, and if you're looking to go back in time, just hop onto our website, JillOnMoney.com. Mark and the Mad Russian are busy at work. When is it officially going to be unveiled, Mark? Do you have a date? It's up to me. Oh, I don't know if I can do it. Anyway, we've got a new look, a new website. It's very exciting, and it'll be sometime in January. It might be the beginning of January, maybe January 1st. Has to go live on a day that you're working, maybe January 2nd. Have to think about that. Anyway, so next hour, another one of our favorite interviews is with Bill McRaven. I mean, I shouldn't say Bill, William H. McRaven. He is an amazing human being. He wrote a book called Make Your Bed. But really, that's not what he's famous for. He is a retired U.S. naval admiral. But he had done a great interview. I'm sorry, he did a great speech, a commencement speech, which he turned into a book, Make Your Bed, Little Things That Can Change Your Life and Maybe the World. Coming up next, one of our favorite interviews of 2017 with William McRaven. You're listening to Jill on Money. We'll be right back.
It's the weekend, which means it's time for Jill on Money, the show that makes money fun and just happens to answer all your financial questions. Here's your host, Jill Schlesinger.
Okay, it's hour number 2. It's the weekend before Christmas, and we are pre-taping this, so don't call us this minute. Don't send emails. We're not checking anything. Mark is being an elf. I am being a good Jewish girl, which means that I am preparing my lasagna for my Italian Catholic in-laws. And isn't that good? Do you think it's pretty bold of me, Mark, to actually take on the role of the cook for the family? Right? It's pretty gutsy. I have made it before, of course. Actually, you know what else I've made? I made eggplant parm, which is much harder to make than lasagna. Much messier. Oh, yeah. Because you got to get the eggplant just right. That's my feeling. All right, good. Mark's going to cook it for me. Okay, for this Christmas weekend, we're replaying some of our favorite interviews of the year. And this hour, we are going with Mark's second favorite, Admiral William H. McRaven, U.S. Navy retired. He's the author of Make Your Bed, Little Things That Can Change Your Life and Maybe the World. Here's our interview with Bill McRaven. You were in the armed forces for 37 years, right. And Navy SEAL, 4-star Admiral, which, how many of those are there?
Not a lot.
Yeah, I'm thinking a few. Your final assignment was as commander of all U.S. Special Operations Forces, and you are now the chancellor of the University of Texas system, which is pretty amazing.
Hook 'em horns.
Hook 'em horns, and he just showed me how to do it correctly.
Well, that's our flagship, but the system has got 14 institutions, and they're all great.
All right, you're talking to us today. We are recording this on the day after the evening when the United States launched airstrikes against Syria. And I'm wondering if you can just give us a little bit of an inside peek as to what happens in that moment? Like, how does this all start to happen? And what is the decision-making process that occurs leading up to the final go do it?
Right. Well, I think in this case, obviously President Trump realized we needed to take some sort of decisive action. And so he'll turn to the Secretary of Defense, Jim Mattis, and to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Joe Dunford, and he will ask for options. What are our options in dealing with this? And the military always has options on the table. We've obviously been looking at Syria for quite some time. So my guess is they looked at everything from, we can create no-fly zones, we can create safe areas, but in light of the fact that we had an attack using sarin gas, we need a proportional, definitive strike. So the TLAMs, the Tomahawk Land Attack Missiles, the cruise missiles as they're referred to, are always a good option because it keeps the troops out of harm's way. They are precision weapon systems, can be launched from offshore, as you've seen. And so, again, I compliment the president for making a decisive move and a proportional move. And again, this is important when you are playing the great game to make sure that you don't overstep your bounds a little bit in terms of just wiping out the entire Syrian Air Force. So I think it was the appropriate step.
And in that moment where you were in a similar situation, say, with President Obama,
Sure.
Describe just a little bit about having to present the president with options. Will he then say, Bill, what do you think? Or do you immediately say, here are your 5 options, this is what I think you should do?
No. At least with President Obama, and I have not met President Trump, so I can't speak to President Trump. But I'm sure the process is pretty much the same, which, again, the military leaders will come in and they will provide options. Now, if the president says, what is your number one option, then they're certainly prepared to provide that. But invariably, there's a dialogue, as there was with President Obama during the bin Laden raid. And I can tell you President Obama asked a lot of good questions, hard questions, compelling and probing questions. And my guess is President Trump did the same thing. He wanted to know, what are the risks involved? What are our chances of success? I mean, these are kind of natural questions that the president will ask the military leaders.
And so when President Obama asked some of those hard questions, give me an example of some of the, like, what would he have asked?
Well, the president always wants to know the risk to the force.
Right.
And I'm sure the same thing was asked from President Trump to Secretary Mattis. But in the case of the bin Laden raid, President Obama wanted to understand, okay, if I agree to this raid, then how much risk will be, what is the threat to your men on the ground? And how are you going to mitigate that risk? And so this is part of the plan that any military commander has to bring to a president is, force protection, get the mission done, make sure you're protecting the force as best you can, explain the risks to the president of the United States.
And is there ever a time where the president asked you a question and it made you rethink your position?
In the case of the bin Laden raid, yes. I mean, in terms of tightening up the planning on the mission, again, I gave the president kind of a broad option. Look, we'll do a helicopter raid. We'll get on the ground. But if we encounter the Pakistanis, we have this option, or this option. And so the president and myself and a number of members of the national security team talked through those and helped refine the plan. And my guess is, again, with President Trump, he had a discussion with his military leaders and potentially, tightened up the plan a little bit.
Was the bin Laden raid, which obviously it went in your direction, did you have apprehension about it?
No, never.
Really? How come?
No, because I knew what my forces were capable of doing. This was not a terribly complex mission. It was a long helicopter ride, about 162 miles from Afghanistan into Abbottabad, Pakistan. But I knew the SEALs were, highly trained. They were all combat veterans. The helicopter pilots were all combat veterans. We had, good overhead surveillance. We had appropriate packages in the event they got into trouble. So we had a plan A, a plan B, a plan C, and a plan D. And I was very confident that we could carry out any one of those if we needed to. So no, I wasn't. Again, you're always worried about the safety of your troops. They're your men in this case, and I wanted them all to come back safely. But we also wanted to accomplish the mission. I was confident we could do both.
And you did it.
And we were fortunate we did it. The guys did it.
The guys did it. That's pretty great. When I don't know why, but I always think that with and I told you before we went on the air that I have come married into a military family. And it was striking to me that it never seemed like our nephew would talk about being fearful. But you have to be afraid in these in various missions. What made you afraid along the way?
Yeah, I think, you have to be a little bit scared. Because that's kind of what keeps you on edge and keeps you looking for potential problem areas. Where are you going to get ambushed? How's the helicopter going to get from point A to point B? If you're not scared going into these missions, then you probably haven't been on them before. You ought to have a little bit of heightened sense of anxiety, and I think every operator does. But the flip side of that is you're very well trained. And you recognize that your training and the support you have from the other members of your team or the military are going to be there to help you out. So, whatever that apprehension is, I think, again, you can reduce some of that concern by realizing you've got great teammates.
We'll get back to our interview with Bill McRaven. You're listening to Jill on Money, 855-411-JILL. Send us an email, askjill@jillonmoney.com. We'll be right back. You're back with Jill on Money. This is the pre-Christmas weekend, and in honor of the holidays, we are replaying some of the great interviews that we've conducted throughout the year. When Mark first found this interviewee, I was so excited because I had never actually interviewed an admiral before. Admiral McRaven, who wrote a book, and that was all well and good about the things you need to do to kind of make sure you do the right things in your life. But I remember watching those photos and looking at the Situation Room with President Obama, Vice President Biden, members of the president's national security team, to see the U.S. Special Operations Forces in the bin Laden raid. Well, the person who was overseeing that is our guest, William H. McRaven. He's a retired U.S. naval officer, and he wrote a book called Make Your Bed, Little Things That Can Change Your Life and Maybe the World. And when you hear about kind of those pieces of what you should be doing, just know that it is coming from somebody who has experience beyond the realm of anything that we could imagine. Here's our interview, more of our interview with Bill McRaven. Now to kind of shift gears. In 2014, you're delivering a commencement speech at the University of Texas, right?
Right.
And first of all, how did that come about? Who asked you to do that?
Well, the president of the University, Bill Powers, asked me to come do the commencement speech at my alma mater, the University of Texas at Austin, and I was thrilled to have the opportunity to do it. And it turned out to be just a fantastic night in Austin in May, and 8,000 students and about 20,000 of their parents and best friends. It was a great evening.
And from that commencement speech comes this slim, elegant, and really terrific book called Make Your Bed. Let's start with why you wanted to turn. First of all, by the way, everyone go and check out the speech because it's been downloaded 10 million times, something to that effect. But what made you want to turn it into a book?
Every day, literally every single day since the speech, Saturdays and Sundays included, somebody comes up to me and says, I make my bed, or, I don't ring the bell, or I don't back down from the sharks. But after they tell me that, then they always ask me, what was it that inspired you? Tell me about your experience as a sugar cookie. Tell me about how you didn't back down, or who were the people that inspired you? And, for several years, I was just busy, didn't have time to do it, and finally had an opportunity to. It's a small gift book, but I think it has broad appeal. This is not just a book for commencement. I think it's a book for anybody that goes through life that has to deal with failures, that has great dark moments in life that they have to overcome. So the book was really about people that inspired me. And
let's just start with the number one, which is the title of the book, Make Your Bed. Why is making your bed so important?
Well, at least when I was being raised, my father was an Air Force officer and my mother was a school teacher in Texas. And my mother ensured, more so than my father, that I made my bed every day. But as a young kid, you don't really understand why, other than your mom wanted you to make your bed. When I got to SEAL training, it was something that the SEAL instructors came in and inspected every day. And I didn't really understand it at first. Look, we're here to be, real SEAL warriors. Why are we worried about making our bed? And then all of a sudden, you have this epiphany, which is they recognize that it was kind of the first task of the day. And if you start off your day right by taking a little pride in making your bed, it's a simple task. And if you do it well, then other tasks will come, and then you'll complete the next task. And so it's kind of the first rung on the ladder in the course of your day. But the other thing about making your bed is it shows that if you do the little things well, then maybe you can do the bigger things well. And the SEAL instructors would make sure if you can't make your bed, if you can't make those hospital corners right, if you don't know how to put your wool blanket at the foot of the bed, if you can't take the time to make your bed correctly, how will you ever be a good SEAL running an important mission? So learn to do the little things right, and then that'll help you do the big things right.
Is there something about SEAL training that is different than any other part of the military? What differentiates the SEAL from, the guy who's in the Army? Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, I will tell you, I think almost all the Special Forces training are similar in terms of, there's a selection process where, you're looking for, in my case, they were all men. You're looking for men that you think are going to make it through training. You're trying to ensure that they have kind of the right stuff. All of the Special Forces training, the Ranger training, the SEAL training, I would say the thing that differentiates SEAL training is obviously the water. Mm-hmm. So a lot of my great Army brethren, didn't like the part about being cold, wet, and miserable. That doesn't make them any less tough. Let me tell you, I have seen some of the toughest men I've seen are Army Rangers and Army Green Berets, and we like to think SEAL training is the toughest military training out there. But I think all of them stack up as being pretty tough.
Yeah, it would seem so. So one of the other pieces of this, and as you go through and you give the little things that can change your life, you do talk about making sure that you have good teammates,
right,
and find someone to help you paddle. In the book also you give some great examples in your own life, but I'm just wondering, in your not just career but in your life, talk a little bit about the reliance on others, that team-based approach, because I do feel a tiny bit like sometimes that's lost in this current culture where everyone's sort of sitting alone at a screen, feeling disconnected. How do those connections really foster success?
Well, I talked a little bit about it in the speech, and then I kind of cull it out a little bit in the book. But when you go through SEAL training, you're given what we refer to as an inflatable boat small. It's about an 8 to 10 foot little raft, rubber raft, and you carry it everywhere you go. And the purpose of carrying the raft, it's a 7-man boat crew. But the purpose of carrying it isn't just to carry the boat. It's to recognize that if you're going to get the boat from point A to point B, everybody has to work together as a team. And I don't care whether you're the officer or the junior enlisted guy. If you don't paddle the way you're supposed to paddle, if you don't, stroke hard, if everybody doesn't dig in, then the boat won't get to where it needs to get to. And so the recognition as you go through SEAL training that, you better be a good teammate first. We're called the SEAL teams for a reason. And in fact, when you meet another guy in the SEAL teams, you say, hey, are you in the teams? And so this concept of being a team, everybody having a role to play for you to be successful is important. And then in the book, I talk about the fact that I had a parachute accident back in 2001. Up to that point in my career, I thought, like a lot of SEALs, that maybe I was a little invincible. I'd had some life-threatening situations in the air, underwater, and other places, and I'd always managed to get out of it, but not this time. And so I got pretty banged up in a free fall parachute jump. And frankly, I thought my career was over. I was banged up that badly. But fortunately, I had a lot of folks, my wife in particular, but my boss, Admiral Eric Olson, friends came by to see me, wished me well, helped me with my therapy, my physical therapy. And I would never be where I am today were it not for the fact that everybody came together to help me through that tough event in my life.
How did that change you going forward when you actually did get injured? Did you change? Did your mindset change about how you approached what you did or how you approached others?
I think, up to that point in time, I always recognized the value of team. But I was never the individual that kind of needed the help in terms of the other team helping me. That was a point in time where I went, I'm just as vulnerable as everybody else. Life can be very, very fragile. I mean, I realized that once again, my life was spared, and it all happened in an instant. I'd had a number of those in my career leading up to the parachute accident, but again, I'd always managed to do the right thing and gotten out of it. Now all of a sudden, I'm badly injured, and realize that, wow, moving forward, this is easier than I thought in terms of the potential to get injured. So after 9/11, this occurred before 9/11. After 9/11, as I watched my soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines and others, and saw the wounds that they suffered, you realize that you needed to be in a position, I needed to be in a position to help them, other people needed to be in a position to help them, because we all need people to help us get through life.
We'll get back to our interview with Bill McRaven in just a minute. If you have a financial question this holiday weekend, 855-411-JILL. Send us an email. Ask Jill at jillonmoney.com. We'll be right back.
Poor Rudolph, joining in the reindeer games. Then one foggy Christmas Eve.
You're back with Jill on Money. You can tell from the music that it is our holiday special.
Won't you guide my sleigh tonight?
In honor of that fact, we are replaying some of the wonderful interviews that we've been really just so honored to conduct this year. It's been amazing. This one specifically holds a close spot in my heart. Retired Admiral William McRaven, who wrote the book called Make Your Bed. It was really, his presence is so amazing. And I remember Mark and I were both a little bit starstruck when he came in. I also understand that this is a man who had to oversee some pretty horrible things in his life. And he recounts that with us and how he was able to push through some of those tough times. So here's more of our interview with Bill McRaven. That life's not fair is something that seems to have quite a bit of resonance in your world, because unfair things happen all the time.
You bet.
And how do you get through those unfair things?
Yeah, again, when we were going through training, there were a lot of folks that felt, if they were the best runner that day, then they would be rewarded for that. If they had the best uniform, they would be rewarded for that. There was this sense of, if I perform well, everything's going to fall into place. But it didn't. Right. And this concept of being a sugar cookie, as I refer to in the chapter, a sugar cookie was an instructor would just arbitrarily say, McRaven, hit the surf. You had to hit the surf, get all wet, then roll around in the sand. And so you're covered head to toe in sand. And, there was a time when you said, why? My uniform looked good. Everything was great. Mm-hmm. I should be rewarded for that. And the point was, sorry, life isn't fair. You're not always going to be rewarded for things. And so this understanding as you go through life that, life isn't fair. You have to get over it. And you can't spend your time, blaming your parents or blaming your circumstances or blaming your bosses. Life's not fair. But if you press on, if you accept the fact that every once in a while things are going to just go, not go your way, get over it and move on.
And does that mean, though, as a boss, because you're a boss of a lot of people, that that you don't? I mean, really bad things happen. That's one thing. Right. But like when somewhat bad things, are you hardened to that? In other words, I don't know. Like I'm feeling like in the military, that's a lesson. Like, of course you have to move on. Like we have a mission here. But in an organization, like I'm working at CBS, and like, a story gets killed. Life's not fair. Move on. And you've just spent hours and hours doing this, and it is true. But do you get to sit on your pity pot for like 5 minutes?
Yeah, probably everybody does for a few minutes, that's just human nature. But the point is, don't sit on it for too long.
Yeah.
Like I said, sometimes you bust your tail and things just don't work out well.
Can you talk a little bit about failure? Because I never associate, military and failure as, how you come through that. Because I feel like sometimes failure can result in the loss of life and injury. Right. And so how do you come on the other side of that? That's a much more difficult thing than saying, life's unfair. Failure is a big deal.
Failure is a big deal, particularly in a combat situation. Fortunately, by the time I was in combat after 9/11. I was a pretty seasoned SEAL officer. I'd been in about 26 years, and I'd had a number of failures, not combat related, but a number of failures in my career. And you do the best to show that you're better than your failure. But when it comes to combat, your failures can, in fact, result in the deaths of civilians, unfortunately, and some of your soldiers. But what you have to realize is you have to learn from your mistakes, and particularly in combat. You're going to make mistakes. Combat moves at a pace that you don't control sometimes. We always say that the enemy has a vote, so you can build a great plan, but the enemy may not react the way you expected, and unfortunately, every once in a while, you'll lose guys. But a good combat leader recognizes that, you can't sit on your pity pot too long. You have to say, what did I learn from that? How are we going to do better next time? But you have to be prepared to make the next tough decision as a combat leader. And I think the difference between a great combat leader and a good combat leader is the great ones overcome failure as quickly as possible. They learn from it, and then they make the next tough decision. Because if you're not prepared to make the next tough decision, then you're going to lose more young men and women. And so that's the important thing to recognize in combat.
You just talked about the difference between good and great. So who inspired you in your career?
Oh, a lot of people inspire me in my career. But I'll tell you, invariably, probably not who people think. The kids that inspired me were the young soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines I met, the ones that had families with kids. And you'd watch these young soldiers go overseas and come back, and then 8 months later they're back overseas again, and they do it year after year after year. And the wife stays at home and takes care of the kids, or the husband stays at home in some cases and takes care of the kids as the wife is forward. These are the men and women that I think are truly inspiring, and they don't nobody writes books about them. They're not going to have any monuments built to them, but they are the American soldier. And so, they're what's really inspiring.
What don't we civilians really understand about the military life? What are some of the things we just don't get and we could never get?
Well, I don't know that you could never get it, but the military life is a life of sacrifice. You don't go into the military. A lot of people say, well, why'd you go in the military? And people will say, well, to serve my country. And certainly people want to serve their country. But most young men and women that go into the military, I think initially there's this kind of sense of a challenge. I want to make it through basic training, or I want to make it through SEAL training or Ranger training. And then there's a little sense of adventure. You go from a challenge to an adventure, and now, you're in the SEALs. And in my case, you're traveling around the world, you're jumping out of airplanes, you're locking out of submarines. You have this adventure. And then at some point in time in your career, it kind of becomes a profession. But then after that, it becomes a calling. And that's really kind of when you hit your peak. For me, the calling really came after 9/11. What I saw with the young men and women that came in right after 9/11 was, they jumped, my 26 years, and within a short period of time, they had gone from the challenge, the adventure, the profession to a calling. And that calling required sacrifice. And so it's just hard to appreciate the sacrifice of these young soldiers day in and day out going on combat missions, year after year deploying. Every couple of years moving their family from one geographic location to the next, and now the kids have got to make new friends in school. These are the sacrifices. We're happy to bear that burden and bear that sacrifice.
We'll get back to our interview with Bill McRaven. It is the Jill on Money Christmas special. When we return, more of one of our favorite interviews of 2017. We'll be right back. You're back with Jill on Money. For Christmas, maybe Mark got me tickets to the Bruce Springsteen on Broadway special. I hear they're just going for $1,000 each. In no universe would I pay $1,000 even to see the boss. I just want to say. That is absurd. Anyway, this is the Christmas Jill on Money special. It's the weekend before Christmas. We are pre-recording these bumps in and out, but we are also re-airing some of our favorite interviews of the year. And we are Coming to the end of our interview with retired Admiral William McRaven. He is the author of Make Your Bed, Little Things That Can Change Your Life and Maybe the World. When you're in a position like his, indeed, one of the things that becomes pretty important is being able to rise to the occasion. Here's more of our interview with Bill McRaven. You talk about rising to the occasion, and I feel like, you're in this dangerous place and you're trained in a certain way. You are going to rise to the occasion. But how do civilians rise to the occasion in your lives? How do you see that playing out?
Yeah, sometimes I think it's just something deep, deep inside that comes up when a dark moment occurs. I don't know that you can plan for it. I don't know that you can prepare for it. I don't know that even the soldiers I've met fully prepare for it. When you lose a loved one, I don't care whether you lose them on the battlefield or you lose them in a car accident or they die of cancer. You find out really who you are in those dark moments. And I think we all have it inside us. And the point of the book is, you don't have to be a superhero to rise to the occasion. But dig deep. It's in there. And the people around you are going to need you to rise to that occasion when bad things happen. So this is more of a hope that people that read the book will realize that they have it within themselves to be this person when difficult things happen.
In your career, as you look back, were you able to identify people who you said, that guy, that woman, that's a leader?
Absolutely.
Easily?
Pretty easily. Yeah.
And what are some of those attributes that would make you poised to be a leader?
Yeah, they are generally people persons. They understand how to build a team, as we talked about. They recognize that it's not about them. They are kind of a servant leader. I mean, I think the great leaders are servant leaders. I love this saying from Pope Francis that, a shepherd should smell like his sheep. And I think, we have learned that in the military that great leaders are the ones that are out with the troops. And I don't care whether you're a non-commissioned officer, to be a great leader, you've got to be out. You've got to suffer the hardships. You have to lead from the front, as we say. Sometimes leading from the front is literally jumping out of the airplane first. Sometimes leading from the front is being the last in the chow line to get chow. But leading from the front means setting the example and doing the difficult things. You don't have to be the best at everything. In fact, great leaders are rarely the best at everything. But they've got to respect the people that work for them. They've got to be able to build the team around them. And you can see that pretty quickly. I mean, there are some folks that are a little too full of themselves, that think they always have the right plan, that they're the smartest man or woman in the room. Those people you have to be a little bit careful of. Now, every once in a while, they turn out to be great leaders as well. But I tell you, more times than not, it's that man or woman who knows how to build a team, who is the servant leader, who respects the people that work for them, and who sets the example and does things that are moral, legal, and ethical.
When you look at, say, corporate America now, and you maybe read stories in the papers about this CEO does this or this malfeasance of that, I can only imagine that somebody like you, a true leader who's selfless in many ways, that really must pain you in some ways to read stories or hear things like that. Well,
we're not perfect in the military, but I think as an organization, we work hard to instill the right values in people. And I think most of the men and women I've worked with in the military adhere to those values. But, again, I have one litmus test for every decision we make. And as I said, you have to do things that are moral, legal, and ethical. And if your decision, passes that litmus test, then it's probably a good decision. And most leaders know when things aren't moral, legal, or ethical. It's not always easy to be good, though. The circumstances that swirl around you sometimes, nobody's perfect. And again, we're going to make mistakes. And sometimes as hard as you try to be moral, legal, and ethical, it doesn't work out. And we talk about your integrity being the most important thing, but frankly, you're the only one that can lose your integrity. And it happens sometimes. Again, that's a time when you just have to say, look, I made a mistake. I'm going to figure out how to do better next time and move on.
Now that you are out of the military and like in academia, which is a whole nother universe.
I love it.
How has the transition been?
Transition's been great. I'm used to running a large organization. So in my role as the chancellor of the University of Texas system, I'm the CEO over these 14 institutions. And we were talking before the beginning of the broadcast about UT Austin. But of course, that is our flagship, but it is hardly the only institution. We have 8 academic institutions and then 6 health-related institutions. And we've got 6 medical schools. But I got to tell you, the best thing about the job is looking at these, first in family to go to college. We have a large Hispanic population in Texas and down at UT Rio Grande Valley and University of Texas El Paso and UT San Antonio. You see these kids that are the first in their family ever to go to school. And you realize they have just changed the entire trajectory of their family forever. Because, what statistics show is if you go to college, chances are very high your kids are going to go to college and their kids are going to go to college. And everything about going to college, frankly, makes you a better person. Statistically speaking, not only do you make more money, but you're less likely to be racist and bigoted, and you're going to be healthier. Everything about spending time on a college campus is actually good for human beings.
All right, that wraps up one of our most favorite interviews of the year, retired Admiral Bill McRaven, author of Make Your Bed. When we return, a few closing thoughts before you hit the road for the holidays. It's Jill on Money, 855-411-JILL. Send us an email, askjill@jillonmoney.com. We'll be right back. You're back with Jill on Money. Now, we usually end with a little last financial question, but it's the weekend before Christmas. So instead, what I thought would be fun would be to give you some holiday books to just bang out here, because then why go run around and get a bunch of presents that may not actually have meaning to a lot of people? I think that our 2 guests today, right there, you've got some great gift ideas. Admiral Bill McRaven, you could go out and just easily, boom, go out and get it right now. Go get Make Your Bed. Little things that can change your life and maybe the world. You can also go out and buy Diana Henriques' book, Wizard of Lies. That's the story of Bernie Madoff. And also, for you financial historians out there, her book that was released this year, 2017, that's a phenomenal book. It's called A First Class Catastrophe. It's about the crash of 1987. Now, here's a little preview from next week. We are going to play 2 more interviews, and both of them are authors. And these could be fantastic gifts that you could actually find your loved ones and say, I got you something really smart. Kathy O'Neill's Weapons of Math Destruction. That's basically the story of how algorithms can lead to inequality in our society. And then we've got the Financial Times' Tim Harford. He wrote 50 inventions that shaped the modern economy. He also wrote the book Messy. So there you have 5 books right there to get a bunch of people. Stocking stuffers, or just, maybe you send something to be downloaded. Either way. Mark, what is your favorite book that you've read this year? Yeah, so Mark read The Wizard of Lies. He loved it. And he became obsessed with Bernie Madoff also. There is that. I am going to put a plug in for another book, and that is a book of fiction. It's 800 pages, guys. Sorry. Hana Yanagihara. The book is A Little Life. It was actually released a couple of years ago. Life-changing. Unbelievable. I recommend it highly. I wish you all who are celebrating a very Merry Christmas. And for everyone else, I hope you have a delicious Chinese food meal and see a great movie. It's Jill on Money, and we'll see you next week for our New Year's special. Thanks for listening.